Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jessica Coonan. I'm with New York Sea Grant, and I will be moderating today's webinar along with Pam Rubinoff of Rhode Island Sea Grant and Kathleen Phelan of New York Sea Grant's going to help us out with the chat. So this webinar series came together as part of a collective effort between New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts Woods Hole, and other Northeast Sea Grants to, number one, increase our programming and capacity for community monitoring of our shorelines, and number two, to get clear on how to use that data to help inform decision making. We know that increases in precipitation, storm frequency and intensity, and sea level are accelerating throughout the Northeast, and it's more important than ever to have these systems in place to document these changes. And while the methods for documenting change are not new, we as practitioners really wanted to focus on how to get the most out of these tools to create quality outreach products that are going to add value for our stakeholders. So our approach has been to convene some of our Northeast Sea Grant colleagues in a learning network over the past year to share best practices, lessons learned, to have discussions, to conduct research on all these tools and methods currently being used throughout the US. And we're calling ourselves Coastal Commons for community monitoring of shorelines. As part of this learning network, we are pleased to present our first webinar in a series of 4 that will take place over the next year. Today, we're going to focus on coastal flood monitoring, and next month we'll be focusing on coastal erosion. And we encourage you to register and join us for that one as well. We'll throw the link in the chat for you. And then the next 2 webinars will take place in spring and summer of 2022, and we will keep you posted on that. So today we're going to be hearing from 3 guest speakers at different levels of government across 3 states to hear how they are using shoreline flood data in decision making that ranges from managed retreat to investing in technology to disaster response and planning. We have kind of a hybrid format where each presenter is going to talk for 10 minutes about their specific project, and then we'll have a panel discussion for the final 15 to 20 minutes. We ask that you please submit questions throughout the webinar to our panelists by typing them into the Q&A box. You can open this by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar window. And we may also have time to take 1 or 2 questions after each individual presentation, but we encourage questions for the panel as a whole. And we're going to address questions depending on relevance to the conversation and if we have time. So the chat feature is also enabled for you to comment and interact with each other during the presentation. If you type a question in the chat, if you forget, we'll just remind you to please enter it into the Q&A box. We are recording today's webinar, and we're going to make it available on the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute YouTube page. But eventually this video and this project will have its own webpage on the Woods Hole Sea Grant site. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome our first presenter for today. We're looking forward to a great discussion and your questions. So with that, I will hand it over to Bob Ruley, who is Planning Director for the town of Warren, Rhode Island. Oh, it looks like you're muted, Bob.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Ruley. As Jessica said, I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development for Warren, Rhode Island. For those that have never heard of Warren, we are the smallest town in the smallest county in the smallest state. Our average elevation in town is 7 feet, so sea level rise is something that we worry about on a daily basis. What I'm going to talk about today is we actually have an ongoing project called Market to Metacom. The market piece is about adaptation and managed retreat. The Metacom is about economic redevelopment, but I'm going to focus on Market Street. this is, we were able to start this project through a grant that we got through the Southeast New England program. We've done 3 community workshops. These are excerpts from those workshops. I'm not going to go into the detail, but this is really about storytelling and the story that we're trying to tell the community as well as elected officials are what the impacts of sea level rise and flooding is going to be in the future. So the methodology and the data that we have used is coming from property and tax data, GIS through both the state and town site, NOAA, Storm Tools, which was developed at the Coastal Resource Institute at URI, FEMA and flood factor for disaster impact estimates. And then as we look at road and bridge data, that's a combination of RIDOT, Rhode Island Department of Transportation, statewide planning, and then national criteria. So right now we're at the concept level. So we're just trying to determine order of magnitude. We're applying for additional funds as we get a deeper dive into this. And then why are we doing it? Obviously, everyone here is aware that climate change is bringing rising sea levels. We have stronger storms, more intense precipitation events. Already we've participated in a municipal resilience program that was put together by the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank and the Nature Conservancy. We are finalizing our hazard mitigation plan, and we've done projects with both URI and UPenn. So the Market Street area is approximately 184 acres, 400 buildings, 700 housing units, and 30 businesses. And this is kind of, so what we're trying to show is what the breakdown is of what all that looks like in terms of single family, multifamily, vacant land. So again, this is an area that we know is going to be susceptible to sea level rise. And one thing I wanted to do was not look at FEMA's 50 and 100-year scenarios. I wanted to break it down and look at things in a shorter time frame. So the focus of this is looking at what the impacts would be in 2035 as well as 2050. So depending on who the audience is, I mean, certainly our elected officials are, going to look at what the assessed value is, the number of parcels, average value, the amount of tax revenue that's generated. That's important when we start to talk about what we might lose. So we've taken, like, if we do nothing, this is what's going to happen, to what could we do and what would the cost be for managed retreat and property buyouts. So you can see in the project area that it's already in flood zones on FEMA's AE. This is what our high tide projections look at in 2035, 50, 70, and out to 2100. And this is an intersection that we'll show a picture later, but we're just trying to illustrate for the public what 6 inches of sea level rise would look like in 2035, and then what 3 feet above sea level rise would look like in 2050. And then we took it out to 2070 and then 2100. And this is another street in that area. Again, just showing this for illustration purposes. This is street flooding that we had on September 1st. This was from a rain event. So in this case, it wasn't seawater that was coming in, it was fresh water that was getting pushed back. Storm sewers were having seawater come in one direction and fresh water going in the other direction, and just resulted in some severe flooding. We ended up having one house condemned. So this, again, we're trying to show people what sea level rise looks like with a 100-year coastal storm. And then that's the left-hand side is Market Street. We really don't need the right side is Metacom, but that's not on our agenda today. And then also wanted to look at what impacts to our transportation assets are. 2 of our primary evacuation routes go through this area. So if in fact they were flooded, that causes concerns. And again, just looking at different scenarios in terms of both sea level rise as well as what impacts from 100-year storm surge would be. As I said, it's in an AE zone. As I mentioned, our highest elevation is 7 feet, and the AE requires that any new construction be at least 13 feet above sea level. And for purposes of the public that aren't familiar with how flood insurance works, we included this kind of slide just to show them. So the no action scenarios, if we do nothing, we know that we're going to have a foot of sea level rise by 2035 based on the NOAA projections. And again, we took it out to 2070. And again, looking at what flooding would look like if we don't do anything. And again, this is all storytelling so people can, see. If we told them what it looks like in the abstract, they don't understand it. So we really thought it was important that we give the public visuals. And then we know by 2035 that we'd have 58 properties flooded. Buildings flooded would be 31. We'd lose 57 housing units and 86 residents would be displaced. The building loss costs would only be almost $8 million. Tax revenue loss is 200,000. Then, as you can see, when we get to 2050, those numbers start to grow significantly. So when we look at it and breaking it down into the 4 phases, again, people start to understand that the cost of doing nothing becomes very expensive. The cost to do something is expensive too, but so what's available for the no action? There are flood insurance programs. Whether that's going to sustain itself in the future remains to be seen. There is federal disaster assistance, but again, we're seeing more and more of these events, and at some point, I mean, there's some fear that there won't be money left. And one group that we see missing from a lot of these conversations are both the lenders and the insurance companies. So we hope that we can engage them in the conversations. Concerns to the town are if properties are abandoned, environmental pollution, and then impacts to stormwater quality. So this is one of the intersections that we showed in one of the earlier illustrations on measuring sea level rise. This is on a king tide event. So this area, I mean, this is kind of our poster child for bad things, because in this picture, we have an auto body shop, furniture stripping facility, and a dry cleaner. So if they're getting flooded, the amount of chemicals that are coming back into the freshwater system and into the bay are very concerning. So the impacts of roads, they become impassable, the stormwater systems don't function, accelerated roadway deterioration, and then insurance repair cost. And again, just another illustration of how our roads are impacted if we do nothing. So when we look at phase relocation and restoration scenarios, we looked at it over 4 phases, beginning in 2035. So we're looking at property buyouts, and then restoration of the wetlands, and then also working with Rhode Island Department of Transportation on adaptation. So our phase 1 is in the next 10 years. Start to see what the project area is. The cost of adaptation for this particular phase is almost $15 million. When we go to phase 2, which is up to 2050, it gets to almost to $25 million. If we took it all the way out to 2100, it's $138 million. We would be removing 8 acres of impervious area, creating 34 acres of marshland in the phase 1. And then again, as you see, the numbers go up. This is just giving an illustration to the public of what that area would look like. We are, as I said, working with DOT on a pilot program for road adaptation. There doesn't seem to be a lot of examples of road adaptation, not just in Rhode Island, but anywhere in the country. There's some down in Florida that we've looked at. There's some out in the Midwest, but there's really nothing in New England that we've been able to find. So we're fortunate that we have a partnership with DOT, and then we're also working with URI, University of Rhode Island, on that pilot program. For phase relocation and property buyouts, I mean, we're looking at a number of different financing sources. Some of the FEMA, EPA, Army Corps, USDA, the Infrastructure Bank, and we're also looking at tax increment financing for redeveloped areas of town, so the town would actually have money to put towards property buyouts as well. This is a project website that I recommend that you go to for the entire market to Metacom. We've got a number of different resources on there. There's access to all the public workshops that we've done and all of the mapping that we've done. And that will conclude my portion of the presentation, which I was 44 seconds too long.
Thanks so much, Bob. Really amazing to see all the work that has been going on in Warren and the way that the photos have been used in telling that story. I don't see any questions, but we encourage people to submit them to the Q&A as we go on. And next up, I'm going to welcome Rebecca Fishman from New York City Office of Climate Resilience. So take it away, Rebecca.
Okay, can everyone see my screen and hear me?
Yep.
Awesome, cool. And apologize for wearing a mask. We are back in the office full time. So if you can't hear me or you hear background noise, that's what's going on. So yeah, my name is Rebecca Fishman. I'm a senior policy advisor here at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. And I'm here to talk to you about the New York City Flood Watch program and also our new and emerging program called FLOODNET. Oops, sorry. So why did we start Flood Watch, which is a community science initiative? As Bob was sort of alluding to before, high tides are causing sewer surcharging and overland flooding throughout the East Coast and in New York City. And as sea levels continue to rise, this flooding is going to get worse. New York City doesn't have a streamlined data collection system or mapping platform. And our New York City panel for climate change sea level rise maps and our new stormwater maps need on the ground validation. And we know that residents, just from our community engagement around other coastal protection projects, that residents have unique insights into the timing, scale, and impacts of tidal flooding. So you can see on the picture here, the 2050s tidal flooding as projected by the New York City panel on climate change. And so what are some of the impacts of sunny day flooding? We're seeing infrastructure damage, impairment of city service delivery, mobility restrictions, personal property damage, disruption of daily life, and health and safety concerns. See to the right hand, a sanitation truck getting stuck in floodwaters in Hamilton Beach and Queens, and in the same or nearby location, a woman just walking on her daily commute through floodwaters. So both Flood Watch and our community science initiative as a whole is a multi-pronged program where we're engaging with communities to better monitor urban street level flooding and provide actionable data information to stakeholders. So there's Flood Watch, where folks are reporting and taking pictures of flooding in their neighborhoods, which I'll talk more about. And the social impacts pilot study, which I'll also talk more about, FLOODNET NYC, which is our pilot flood sensor network, and also improved risk communication. So Flood Watch, and just a quick shout out to Katie Graziano, who's here from New York Sea Grant, who has been the project manager and lead on this project for a year or two now. If you have any specific questions about Flood Watch, she's really the person to talk to. But Flood Watch is a collaborative community science project that engages residents in recording flood events and developing a baseline of flooding. So the program is training residents to document and report flooding using a standardized form. Right now we're using Survey 123. This data includes location, time, duration, depth, impacts, and source of flooding. You can see a flyer to the right-hand side of which Katie and Sea Grant has been using to distribute to communities. And our project partners are New York Sea Grant, the Science and Resilience Institute, Jamaica Bay, and the Stevens Institute of Technology. So where have we been doing outreach? Flood Watch is working with community partners and residents to gain on the ground perspective in the neighborhoods there you see in the Bronx, in Gowanus, Brooklyn, in Coney Island, Hamilton Beach, Broad Channel, and Far Rockaway. Recruitment is through community events, presentations, community board outreach, partnerships with my office and other agencies in New York City government, through emails, social media, and through referrals. So the data, how do we use the data? The data is used in flood forums to educate residents on flood risk, flood insurance, and emergency preparedness. It's used as an advocacy tool for communities, identifies and shares flooding hotspots with the relevant city agencies like our Department of Environmental Protection and our Department of Transportation, and also justifies the funding for our new flood sensor pilot project called FLOODNET. And here you can see an example of the map that's on the Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay's website. All the dots represent flood reports, and then you can click on the dot and see the picture as shown below. So what was our social impacts pilot study? MOCR, together with SRIJB and the New York Sea Grant and the US Forest Service Urban Research Station, partnered on this study. We conducted 9-hour-long individual interviews with FloodWatch participants in different areas of Jamaica Bay, including Howard Beach, Hamilton Beach, and the Rockaways. And we were really trying to add qualitative data and lived experience to all this quantitative data and all these pictures. So in the yellow graph, you can see all the impacts and the references to those impacts. And then on the right-hand column, you can see some of the adaptations that we're starting to note here. And these kind of vary widely from just kind of living on a houseboat as sort of the most extreme example of adaptation to just kind of changing your travel routes or changing event timing based on high tides. So here are just some call outs of our interviews about adaptation, local ecological knowledge, and community connectedness and civic engagement. So just talking about how folks are really dealing with and are kind of very attuned with the high tides, having to go to work 2 hours early or staying 2 hours late. People are starting to notice that with things like the full moon, tides are getting worse. And community associations and some of the neighborhood groups in these areas are becoming more tight-knit and having larger participation as people want to kind of learn from each other and talk through adaptation. So FloodNet NYC, which is our pilot flood sensor network again, is a consortium of research institutions, including NYU, CUNY, and the Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay, to design, build, and test and deploy low-cost, robust flood sensors. These flood sensors are supposed to monitor hyperlocal street level flooding. We want to develop we're in the process of developing a real-time dashboard to contextualize and communicate the data. We want to provide quantitative, consistent data to inform preparedness and emergency response, both at the resident scale and at the government scale, and then also validating future flood models. And this includes future sea level rise maps and also stormwater maps. We're working to pilot neighborhoods with different flooding profiles. So different flooding profiles, meaning like overland flooding and sewer surcharging versus a lot of pluvial flooding or rain flooding in Hamilton Beach, Queens, and Gowanus and Brooklyn. And we just received some new funding from in New York City. So we're expanding the program to 500 sensors over 5 years to cover both inland and coastal flooding. So here you can see our sensors in action during a winter flood in Hamilton Beach in Queens. We have a temporary flood monitoring dashboard to the left. You can see the graduate students and undergrad students that helped install the sensors and kind of how the sensor is encased in a long tube to help protect it as one of our sensor prototypes. And then here's our flood sensor data in Gowanus. We were able to track flooding during Tropical Storm Henri and the remnants of Hurricane Ida. And we saw some really massive flooding with the worst being at Carroll and 4th Avenue, which was around 30 inches of flooding at peak. So you can see here also that we were able to document 2 peaks of flooding during Henri. So there were 2 floods, it receded and went up again. And during Ida, there was just so much more water that it took a much longer time to recede. And we were able to capture all that data with these sensors. And those are pictures of what the Hamilton Beach sensors are from CUNY. These sensors are from NYU, and it's a much smaller sensor without that PVC protection. And ultimately, we will create sort of a hybrid sensor that will go into mass production to reach our goal of 500 sensors. Oh, sorry, I don't know why this image isn't showing up. Apologies, but we got a grant from the New York Empire State Development Corporation to partner with a design and development agency to make this data dashboard. So we want to make the data collected accessible and understandable to various stakeholders, including community groups, researchers, and city agencies. So we're having a lot of community meetings and design workshops. They'll display sensor locations, current readings, and temporal flooding events. And it will allow for commenting and interaction between people within the platform. We also want the ability to include other data like flood hazard layers, historical streams and wetlands, so we can really see why the water is moving like it is, meteorological data, which is like rain data and temperature data, and 311, which is our local complaint platform. And any sort of additional needs that surface through like community and stakeholder engagement that we're doing right now. So on the risk communication side, the community science and flood sensor data is helping to better define minor and moderate flood levels and thresholds at really micro scales, which we weren't able to do before. New York Sea Grant and SRIJB are sending out mass emails for higher than normal high tide events, so folks involved in the program can get good warning. And there's new messaging around preparedness, including moving cars and avoiding floodwater. So starting to get on the adaptation side as well. It's a partnership between the New York City Emergency Management and the National Weather Service. We're collecting these impacts to inform forecasting and those thresholds I was talking about. And we're also adding preparedness language to coastal flood warnings, watches, and statements. And you can see below the new emergency text that we've added to those watches. So people know like how dangerous the waters are, to not drive through them, and also to wash your car afterwards to avoid the corrosive impacts of salt water. So what are some of our next steps? For Floodwatch, we want to continue to grow and maintain the community partnerships and involvement, which means sustained funding and staffing. For the social impact study, we are hoping to apply for grants to build from this pilot study and one that's more robust. For FLOODNET NYC, we want to build and refine that data dashboard, expand the flood sensor network, create a design to manufacture file, to mass produce those sensors. We need to do some program building with this new funding, which includes long-term staffing. On the risk communication side, we want to continue to refine the messaging and geographical customization. And for city response, we really want to start to build a suite of short-term, low to medium cost approaches to relieve the impact of living with water. So that's it for me. Thank you all so much. Looking forward to discussing more later.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And it looks like the questions are rolling in. So thank you, everyone. I think we have time for one or two questions for Rebecca right now. And thank you, Bob, for answering them in the text in the Q&A. So I'll hand it over to Pam to ask those questions.
Great. There are a variety of questions, very detailed ones about sensors and survey 123, and maybe you could answer that directly afterwards and everybody will see. But thank you, Rebecca. The Floodwatch initiative has the Floodwatch initiative gained traction with the residents that you hope to engage as community scientists? Are people using the Floodwatch survey form? And that's from Tom.
Yeah, so we definitely have gotten increased participation over the years, and we've also expanded our geographic reach. So we're happy, and we think we're reaching a lot more people than initially anticipated. We're having a little bit more trouble with the survey 123 usage. So a lot of folks have been just posting on our Facebook page and groups and kind of responding via email, and that's kind of their preferred method of communication. And a lot of people in our program are retired or older and not as comfortable with technology. So we're still definitely struggling with the survey 123 app and kind of getting people on board and training. But our SRJB, our Sea Grant manager has been putting in a huge effort to get more people to use it, because it really helps on the data backend side and the data processing. A lot less manual data work and analysis.
Great. Thank you. And as you'll see, Bob answered a couple questions that were there, including, that use of the visuals, use of the photos really help people to understand what's happening. And it sounds like you've been using them as well, Rebecca, to link with the data. So Jess, do you want to go on to the next one, or should we ask more questions? And Jess, Rebecca, you could just add in some comments if you would.
Yeah, I think we'll move on to Julia's presentation now, and we'll follow up with what we didn't get to afterwards. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you all.
And so now we'll be hearing from Julia Neisel from the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. And I think you'll actually find a lot of similarities between what Bob and Rebecca have already said in terms of the common types of flooding impacts that we're seeing in Massachusetts, and then also the power of citizen science and the use of photographs in terms of raising awareness about impacts and informing management. So I'm going to focus on a tool called MyCoast, and if I can just advance the screen, hold on one second. There we go. The tool is actually largely driven by the types of observations that we've seen over the last 20 years with our state coastal storm damage assessment team. Since Hurricane Bob back in 1991, we've had a core group of local, state, and federal agency volunteers that are willing to go out during a storm or immediately after a storm subsides and relay back what they're seeing on the ground to inform emergency response and recovery efforts. So as you can see here, kind of the lowest threshold events produce splashover of our seawalls and revetments, and then also water running up onto roads and flooding of low-lying roads. Homes that are built right along the shoreline, often behind seawalls that were built prior to coastal management regulations, are seeing decking being torn off, as well as siding and damage to other structural components. And then when the floodwaters recede, we do see lowering of the beach and exposure of the toe of a lot of these structures. So back in the 2009 timeframe, we formally partnered with the National Weather Service office in Taunton at the time to try and correlate the common impacts that we were seeing and reporting back in verbally to our State Emergency Operations Center with the minor, moderate, and major coastal flooding definitions that the Weather Service was using to alert the public. And we were very fortunate in the December 2010 storm to get some high profile attention on storm team activities and the value of standardized reporting of coastal flooding impacts. So in the 2011 timeframe, we launched the current version of the MyCoast tool in Massachusetts. And over the last decade, the tool has actually expanded to other states, and additional tools have been added to the platform. So states like Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Maryland, South Carolina, Washington are all on the platform and actively inputting reports. We are very fortunate to have an iPhone and Android app with the tool to make reporting quick and easy. All of the information goes into a database on the back end, and we're happy to report over a 10-year time frame, we actually have 404 users that have registered to use the app in Massachusetts. And we have really good distribution of the geographic location of those users. So we have a high concentration in the greater Boston area, which I'll talk about later. But we also have good coverage all the way up to the New Hampshire border and down to the Rhode Island border, and we're happy about that. We currently have 4 tools within the MyCoast platform and app. The first tool that we launched was Storm Reporter. So that's communicating the impacts from coastal storms. Then in 2014, we added a king tide tool to the app. And that was actually largely connected with a big push that the EPA did at the time to try and raise the awareness of king tides and to get more people taking photographs and providing observations of those events. In the 2018 timeframe, we added a third tool called the Coastal Resilience Tool, and that's what we use to monitor nature-based projects across the coast to stabilize shorelines and try and mitigate flooding impacts. And just this year, we have a new partner with the tool, the Stone Living Lab, and they are testing out a tool within the system to record beach profiling data that volunteers are recording. Focusing in on the Storm Reporter app, this is just a snapshot of the major categories of impacts that users will toggle through. So you can see that we're looking at everything from road flooding and overwash onto roads to beach and dune erosion. This is a snapshot summary of an inputted report, at least the top half of it. And you can notice that the presentation is very photo driven. And we also link up the information with the NOAA tide gauges. So when we go back and analyze the data, we can correlate the types of impacts to the water level at the time. Over a 10-year timeframe, we have actually had 377 registered individuals contribute to the system. Earlier, I mentioned that we had 404 registered users. We actually have, a few people that just really like the tide chart that's on the app, or people that just like to follow the live feed to see what's going on. And over that 10-year time frame, we've had over 5,500 reports submitted. Some of those reports are reports of no damage, but the ones that do report damage usually attach at least one photo. So we have a very good record of the on-the-ground impacts. I want to move into the King Tide tool. In 2016, we were really fortunate to have a lot of nonprofits in the Boston area be willing to promote the tool. Boston Harbor Now, as well as the New England Aquarium and the Museum of Science, all got together and did a really big push in the media and through their networks to get more people to register, to use the tool, and to share their photos. We were fortunate to get Boston Magazine to pick up the initiative, and we saw a good uptick in users as a result of this exposure. Since that initial push for the broader call of citizen science, we have continued to get support from our nonprofit partners. Here's an example of the Mystic River Watershed Association that put out a call in fall of 2019. And most recently, before the pandemic started, the Museum of Science, with some NOAA funding, was so kind to add the MyCoast tools to the SciStarter platform to give it even more exposure. So we're really happy to have the support and partnership of all of these organizations. In terms of the on-the-ground application of the photographs and observations, first and foremost, the information provides standardized situational awareness across the coast when a coastal storm or a king tide hits. And the photographs and reports can be used for a number of different initiatives. Here, I highlight the emergency response and recovery piece. So when the State Emergency Operations Center is activated for moderate to major events, they use the information to decide where assets need to be deployed to help residents or businesses who are experiencing flooding impacts or other impacts from the storms. The information is also used as baseline information to direct FEMA assessments when there's a major disaster declaration, and it definitely streamlines that process. Rebecca did a great job of talking about her partnership with their National Weather Service office. And similarly, we also have used this data to fine tune the watches and warnings that our local office issues to the public. And in addition, we use the information at the state level to inform adaptation planning, as well as projects that are looking to retrofit structures along the shoreline or do shoreline restoration efforts. And finally, other partners have used the information to ground truth modeling efforts of coastal flooding, as well as erosion. So I'm going to wrap up by just leaving you with the link to the tool if you do want to explore the wealth of information that's in that system.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie. I think we do have time for one question about My Coast in Massachusetts.
Okay. Julia, you've done this a lot for many years. And I guess there's any advice for king tide community science programs in place that are not yet facing major flooding, but will be in the future? You went through a lot of that with the aquarium and with all the different groups in Boston Harbor now. Were those all places that had already been showing problems, or this could be used also as a tool to be saying there's going to be more problems in the future?
We got a lot of attention because we were focusing the call to action on areas that were already experiencing flooding. But the king tide tool is a great resource to get the lower threshold events captured as well, and to track that growing risk over time. Photographs, do a great job of capturing even just an inch or two of water over a parking lot. And, as the extent of that grows with sea level rise, it's a great story to tell when you have that chronology.
Great. Jess, do I have another time for another one, or should we just move on?
Sure.
So Julia, right here, this one just came in from Teresa Crean. Do you know if My Coast has been used in securing design and implementation funding requests?
Well, so my office, the Office of Coastal Zone Management, has a coastal resilience grant program. So it's a grant program to the 78 coastal communities in Massachusetts, as well as nonprofit organizations that have land that's open and accessible to the public. And we have had applications to our grant program that have referenced My Coast photos and data. And that has been a very useful tool to communicate the risks that they're experiencing, and also to ground truth the methodologies that they're using to manage those risks. In terms of other grant programs, I can't speak to whether or not communities are using the information for FEMA funding opportunities, but I don't see why they couldn't use it in their background narrative.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So now we're going to move on to kind of the panel discussion portion of today. And before we get to the other questions, we just wanted to kick it off with one that's a little general, because I know there's a lot of practitioners on the call today. So we're wondering, for each of your programs, you've kind of done this already, but can you just articulate how what you're doing benefits your community and how you're using this information to give back? And we can start with Julia.
Sure, I'll just reiterate some of the points I already made in my presentation, and that's, over time, you're developing this rich story in terms of the extent of impacts and the growing risk along the shoreline. And it's giving people, a powerful tool to be able to really depict those impacts in a nice, tangible way in order to inform management. And, it also, we found that a lot of media groups have grabbed photos from My Coast, so it actually makes their work easier as well.
Excellent. Bob, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, again, as I had said during my presentation, that, if we're talking to people about 50 and 100-year events, they tend to lose interest and think that it's not going to impact them. So we purposely looked at 2035 because we can say, this is really going to happen in the next 14 years. And doing nothing is not an option. And if we do nothing, this is what the impact is going to be. It's either going to be the loss of property, it's going to be a financial loss for the town, people will be displaced. We think through our redevelopment efforts, we can house these people that are displaced, but I think it's, we had an engineer ask initially if we were afraid that we were going to scare people. And my response is, we have a fiduciary duty to educate people. And we're not trying to scare them. I mean, if that's the result, it's not intentional, but this is a real thing that's happening. And, I think often if you have a hurricane or a tornado, people can see instantaneously what the impact of that is. But sea level rise, unless it's an event, if it's not happening today, then it's hard for them to imagine what the impacts are.
Great, thank you for those insights. How about you, Rebecca?
Yeah, so similar to what some of my fellow panelists have said, it's really just creating a baseline data set for data that we did not have before. And that's what's sort of necessary for good and responsive resiliency planning, both really small scales and at much larger scales. So generally, I feel like this is probably the experience throughout the country, but we've only gotten resiliency funding after major storms or hurricanes. And so often a lot of these new opportunities like the FEMA BRIC program require kind of projects that are already developed or kind of ideas or concepts. And this data can help us inform the planning for those projects and kind of having a suite of projects ready to go if we do get funding from the federal government to do this work. And then I think, on the advocacy side, just kind of looking and pinpointing the hotspots and just doing really like low cost or medium cost interventions. We're talking a lot about in New York City, we don't have any like flooded street signs or be warning the street is flooded or turn around or any of that kind of signage. So we're really looking to do that in areas where residents are pointing us as like, the biggest problem spots. And then another kind of idea off of that is, can we have some parking or some free parking lots for folks who live in these low-lying areas to park in when there's going to be a high tide? Because one of the biggest complaints and impacts right now is that people's cars are getting destroyed by regular flooding. So I think that's right now how the data has really been used by communities, but I can see in the long term just having just a wealth of data to guide long-term planning and kind of larger coastal protection or mitigation projects.
Awesome, thank you. And now I'll kick it over to Pam to go
Sure.
through questions.
Well, first of all, I want to ask one, based on what you were just talking about a little, Rebecca, and then going back to some of Bob's comments. Can you talk about the process used to move from the exposure maps, from the photos and the exposure maps to a set of planning actions or adaptation measures to focus on? So Rebecca, you just know, you spoke about some of that, and Bob has it, I believe, on a bigger scale that he showed.
Yeah, so I think what the first thing that we did was we spoke to some partners in our southern states that are a little bit better versed in the adaptation and flooding world to kind of figure out what they've been doing. So we spoke to Norfolk, Virginia, we spoke to some communities in Georgia, and they gave us some ideas of those sort of low cost mitigations, which like the road flooding signs, parking, really to deal with like street flooding. So that's kind of where we've started from. And then Sea Grant has been really helpful in convening these flood forums and community workshops where residents are telling us what they want. So they are kind of guiding the adaptation process in a way. And then, we are taking their ideas and seeing what's feasible. Do we have any funding? And going from there.
Thank you, Rebecca. Bob, did you have something to add about your experience and how do you move from this to action?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, Rebecca had touched on this as well. So we just submitted our brick application to continue to look at on the property buyout side. So we can use the information we have to date. But, I think I like to use the example that these projects are like a mosaic. If you're just looking at one piece of it, it's one tile, then you pull back and all these tiles tell a whole different picture. I think it's important that, we kind of look at all of the impacts, whatever the audience is. So for the elected officials, what are they interested in? For residents, what are they interested in? And then reinforcing, as an example, that our evacuation routes are going to be impacted. We've got an at-risk population that wouldn't be able to get to a shelter because the shelter's on the other side of the evacuation route. So I think as you start to reinforce all of those pieces, people, whatever way they're coming from it, it connects with them somehow. And I think that's the thing you need to do, is you've got to get them connected and engaged to believe what you're telling them, which isn't always easy.
Great. Thanks. I have one for all of you here. Since these approaches focus on use of phone apps to collect data, is there a process to check that communities and populations without access to technology and/or for whom English is a second language, so that flood data and risk isn't underrepresented? I'll share one recommendation, and you guys, just because I heard this while you're thinking, we had been talking to some communities in Providence, and the recommendation was to see if there's an app on Snapchat, because a lot of people use, a lot of the different communities use Snapchat. And so to be able to tie it to an app that they do use, if they do have access to that, and if they do speak English. Julia, did you have a response?
Sure. I mentioned that we have a couple different tiers of reporting. The effort in Massachusetts started with a core team of public officials from the local to federal level, and then we expanded out to bring in residents into the reporting effort. And I would say that with our core functionality, we have about 50 individuals that are well distributed across our exposed coastline. The administrators of the storm team really look closely at where our known exposure is, and to make sure that we do have people on the ground with the core team to report impacts in those areas. And then beyond that, I mentioned that we have a lot of good nonprofits in the greater Boston area promoting the tool. And that's actually where we have the most diversity in terms of race and income, and also English language isolation. So we're fortunate to be able to have those nonprofits promoting the tool and reaching some of those populations that we wouldn't typically reach through a state operations standpoint.
Great. This one's always a good one, and I don't know how many more questions, but has anyone done formal programmatic evaluation to understand the methods that are effective to recruit and retain volunteers? And if you haven't done, well, so let's ask that one, and then I'll ask a follow-up. No, nothing formal. How about,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead, Rebecca.
FloodWatch has done that evaluation, but I can't speak to that. I would have to defer to the program manager of our Sea Grant partner.
Okay.
Yep. There was some, I'm forgetting what it's called. There was a model that she used and the team used to evaluate the program.
Before we go on, sorry.
Great. If Katie, if that's Katie and you want to put something in the chat, please do. But how about anecdotally, lessons learned for recruiting and retaining volunteers?
Pam, it's funny, I'm kind of laughing because I gave you that map showing the location of all the pings of the reporters in Massachusetts. And if I actually zoomed out to the full extent of the individuals that registered in Massachusetts, we actually have people out in Washington, out in in Ireland. We have people down in Florida. So our core reporters have moved on to different locations, but over time we have picked up additional individuals. And, you know, it's been 5 years since we really got that big media push or the call to action in terms of the citizen scientists reporting the king tides. And, you know, it probably is time to think about a more formalized assessment of where we might need to do some more outreach and recruitment.
Maybe that's a project we could all do together.
Right.
Any
Well,
other comments? Oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, I would say that one of our things that we've really been struggling with a little bit is that question around kind of community expectations and what are communities getting out of this. Everyone is very excited about the sensors. They're all very excited that they're getting these sensors. It's great for their personal emergency preparedness and awareness. But the kind of longer term fixes that they're looking for, and I'm talking about like raised streets or a bulkhead or a tide gate, those are pretty cost intensive and require not only significant funding, but also permitting and planning, and that takes a while. So I think it's, you know, how do you get folks involved over a long period of time if they're not necessarily seeing results in the next like year or two, if it's sort of a long-term plan.
Great.
So Pam, I'll offer one other thing. There's a functionality within the MyCoast app to actually push messages and alerts out to the app users. And because we're a state agency, we've kind of shied away from utilizing that functionality of the tool. But moving forward, that is a great opportunity to remind people to go out when we're expecting to see impacts.
Great. We'll get our social media people onto it. Okay. Jess, I see that our time is coming up. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for, well, first of all, thanks to our guests on our panel for giving their time today. I think this is a really important conversation, and I know a lot of people on the call are wondering what's the best way to go about this, starting programs like this. Today I heard a lot of common themes, how important these photos are for storytelling. And even if you might have, you know, really high-tech flood sensors, there's still a very important role for photos, community photos for things like smaller events, community outreach, advocacy, and also getting the word out through media. So with that, I'm going to thank everyone again for attending, and to please register for our webinar next month if you haven't already, where we'll pick up the conversation as related to erosion along the shoreline. So thanks again, everyone.